So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person, and thank you to those of you joining us online remotely for today's lunchtime expedition presentation. My name is Corey Anko. I am the interim curator here of the Draper Natural History Museum. Just a couple quick announcements. Please silence and turn off your mobile cellular devices. We want to thank our sponsors, Sage Creek Grants and the Nancy-Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation, who help make all of these programs possible. We also want to thank you all for being a part of our lecture series. These lectures are being recorded and are available on our YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com and you search for the bear icon, you search Draper Natural History Museum, you can track all of our presentations dating back to 2018. If you'd like to be added to our email list, just come find me after the presentation. Today, we are going to hear from Dr. Embere Hall. Dr. Hall's work revolves around the intersection of science and resource management. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Ecology and Management in Spanish from University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, a Master of Science in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Iowa State University, and a PhD in Ecology from the University of Wyoming. Hall currently serves as the Science, Research, and Analysis Unit Supervisor for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and as an adjunct professor at the University of Wyoming. In these roles, she thinks about how wildlife adjusts to new environments and about management strategies that promote species resilience. Prior to joining the Game and Fish Department, she served as a research scientist with the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. When she's not at work, she enjoys all things outdoorsy: kayaking, skiing, backpacking, road biking, and generally exploring the world. Without further ado, please give Dr. Embere Hall a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Corey, and thanks to everyone for volunteering to spend your lunch hour with us. Got a couple of slide advancers here, so I promised Corey I'll probably hit the wrong button at some point, so bear with me. All right, we're off to a good start. So as Corey mentioned, I'll be talking today about living with climate change. Can behavior help species cope? Now, as all of you know, climate is really important to the ecology and evolution of species. It shapes temperature, moisture, resource availability, and is a key factor in where we find animals, how many of those animals there are, and how well those animals survive. And because of these close relationships with climate, we see a lot of really fascinating adaptations in the animal world that demonstrate how closely tied animals are to climate and their environment. So for example, this bird up on the far right-hand corner of your screen here, this bird has perfected the timing of egg laying such that nestlings hatch right when the food availability is at its peak. Similarly, or at least somewhat similarly, this elk calf here on the lower left-hand side of your screen, it will eventually learn when it needs to leave its summer range in order to trace the path of emerging green vegetation all along its route into summer range, thereby maximizing the resources that are available to it. Now, as you can imagine, these closely timed behaviors that we have relative to climate are under some new stresses and new challenges as we start to see changing climate dynamics. So I think sometimes it's easy here in Wyoming, looking across our vast landscapes and in some cases really relatively untouched wilderness areas, it's easy to think that maybe temperatures and precipitation regimes aren't happening here. Maybe we're a little bit different. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So this figure here shows changes in the average January minimum temperature over the last 30 years compared to normal. So you should be thinking of this as indexing sort of those coldest parts of the year, or when we would expect it to be really chilly out. Now, areas that show up in yellow and red, those indicate places where there's warming. So there's a couple things I want you to take away from this illustration. One, warming is happening and affecting ecosystems statewide. And 2, those areas that are high elevation alpine communities seem to be experiencing a relatively rapid rate. And you can see that particularly here in this western side of the state. All right, so not surprisingly then, if we're seeing that sort of temperature change, there's corresponding management implications. So each of the species pictured here are considered species of greatest conservation need in Wyoming, either in full or in part because of concerns around a changing climate. Here in the center of your screen, this wolverine requires sufficient spring snowpack in order to produce its offspring. While this moose, up here in the left-hand part of your screen, this moose needs access to cool microclimates in order to be able to survive increasingly hot summers. One of the interesting things that we know, and it's not terribly surprising, is really that not all species respond to warming temperatures in the same way. And we know enough to realize that these differences in responses are probably due, or really are, due to 3 things. And when I show you the 3 things, it's going to seem pretty obvious, but I'm going to walk through them anyways. So the first piece is the sensitivity that this species has. Think of this as like an internal physiological tolerance that you have for high temperatures. So the first thing is sensitivity. The second piece is exposure. So basically, how much change are you experiencing in your environment? And the third piece, the piece that I think is really interesting, is this idea of adaptive capacity. And this really touches on the ability of a species to cope with the change that it's experiencing. And interestingly, this is a piece of the equation that we really know, for most species at least, we know very little about. All right, so this guy is known as the American pika. Many of you, if you're from this area or have spent time in the Intermountain West or the Pacific Northwest, you may have seen a pika. I think they're fascinating. They're an incredibly interesting species that really made it a well-suited model for starting to explore some of the questions around adaptive capacity. So first of all, pikas are sensitive to temperature. There was an experiment that was done some time ago that really established that temperatures above 77 degrees, or at least prolonged exposure to temperatures above 77 degrees, can be lethal to pikas. So they are very sensitive to temperature. The second piece here is exposure. And as far as exposure goes, we know that, well, I'll just encourage you to think back to that figure that I showed you earlier, the map of Wyoming and the different temperatures that have been experienced or observed over time. So we know that these high elevation systems are warming relatively quickly. And range-wide, pikas have experienced about a 4-degree increase in annual temperature over the past 50 years. That may not sound like a lot, depending on your perspective, but from the view of a pika that's really dependent on these snow-covered systems, it can kind of be a big deal, or has the potential to be a big deal. The last piece is this adaptive capacity piece, and that's the piece that we want to learn a lot more about. There's a couple of unique things about the ecology of pikas that makes them really interesting in this space. So one, they have some unique strategies. First of all, they're active year-round. Now, those of you that know mountain ecology know that a lot of the vertebrates, and particularly the mammals that are in these high elevation systems, when winter comes, they get out of town, right? They either migrate to lower elevations, as we see in a lot of our ungulate populations, or they do what I do, which is they would sleep all winter, and that's what we see in some of our, high elevation bears, for example. But these guys, I think they're kind of the rock stars of the alpine, right? Because they tough it out all winter. They're active year-round. And in order to support this sort of high-rolling lifestyle, they have to cache food so that they can eat that food during the winter. So that means that during the relatively short summers that they experience in the alpine, they both have to fill their own caloric demand, so be bringing in the food they need to just get through the day, And they also need to be caching all the food that they're going to need to have over winter. So this is a really important piece of their ecology, and we'll come back to it in just a second. The other thing that makes these guys really interesting for studying sort of this adaptive capacity concept is that they have low dispersal. So that means that they can't just pick up and move to somewhere with better conditions when they decide they don't want to be in their place anymore. Pikas are also interesting because we thought we knew their story, right? So there was this paper that came out in, I think it was the early to mid 2000s, like the 2010s, that basically said, pikas are toast, man. Like, they are not going to make it. We're going to see these, what are called in the science world, upslope range retractions, which essentially means that as the climate warms, pikas are going to make this steady march right to the top of the mountain. And when they get there and it gets too warm, we will no longer have pikas in these ecosystems. Well, that sort of set off a lot of alarm bells, as you might imagine, and we started looking closer at the species. And what we found, and this is just so fascinating, what we found is that it isn't this simple story, right? So in some places, like the Southern Great Basin, we are seeing these upslope range retractions, that slow movement of the species upwards. We are seeing that in some places. But in other places, like the Western Great Basin, we've found, well, recently documented populations that are persisting in what we would otherwise call very marginal environments. And then here, a little bit closer to home, in the winds and the bighorns, there's this sort of complicated, non-linear relationship between where you find the species and the temperature that it's experiencing. So all this kind of led us to say, like, wait a minute here. Like, what's going on? This isn't what we thought it was. And for me and my colleagues, that got us thinking a lot about, wait a minute, so what are the species doing that are allowing them to persist in these marginal environments? And are they sort of adjusting some of these critical behaviors, like when and how they eat their food, in order to survive in otherwise stressful environments? And if they do that, is there a long-term benefit? So this is the journey that I would like to embark on with you for the time that we have. And we're going to focus on two key questions. And again, remember, we've talked about the importance of those food caches that they collect. So we're going to think about two things: what to eat and when to eat it. So this is some work that I had such an opportunity to do with a wonderful group of collaborators. And we focused on 10 field sites in the western part of the state, and that's highlighted here on your screen in these yellow dots. So most of our work happened in the Bridger-Teton National Forest. And we focused on, again, 10 sites, and across the 3 field seasons, we sampled 72 individuals. It was a lot of fun. I think at one point I calculated the miles that we covered in the backcountry, and it was something like 1,000 miles in the backcountry. So it was just an incredible opportunity to be out in a really unique ecosystem. And we wanted to monitor these pikas in a couple of different contexts. And specifically, we wanted to be able to see what they were doing in relation to these hay piles, both during the day and at night. So to orient you here a little bit, so for those of you that don't know, this is a pika hay pile. This outlined here in the dashed red is an individual pika. It's got some food in its mouth, taking it back to store it on its hay pile. So in order to be able to observe these critters 24 hours a day, we equipped each individual with these motion-activated, infrared-enabled trail cameras. Essentially, it's a way that allows us, like I said, to see what they're doing both during the day and at night. And then we paired each of these camera setups with these tiny little temperature sensors. And the cool thing about these sensors is it allowed us to be able to see exactly what the temperature was when pikas were engaging in different behaviors. So that was our setup. And over the course of the study, we recorded just over 4,300 videos, which resulted in about 7,800 events that we logged. I'll also say that was a lot of video watching, and I'm extremely grateful for some student interns that helped with this part of the work. All right, so what to eat? I said we were going to think about 2 questions: what to eat and when to eat. What to eat, I'm going to use some science jargon just very quickly. Our actual question was, how does thermoregulatory risk influence forage choice? That's a lot of words. that you can really boil down to, when it's hot out, do you change what you eat, or do you continue to eat exactly the same things? All right, so this led us to a couple of hypotheses. The first hypothesis was, okay, it's hot out. I don't like to be outside when it's hot out, so if I'm gonna be motivated to go outside and get something, it's gonna be darn good. And I'm gonna only pick the best of the best. So in my case, it would be like, a Reese's peanut butter cup. For a pika, it would be a food that is really high in nitrogen and really low in fiber. Those are the things that they particularly like, and if you're a nutritional ecologist, you'll notice that those are things that most herbivores in this kind of a North American system also like. So we would think that the relationship would look something like this. And in this case, as that temperature increases, pikas would become more and more choosy, so more and more likely to go out and get that Snickers bar. That's our first hypothesis. Our second hypothesis was just a general food availability hypothesis. And under this idea, the concept is like, it's hot out, it's stressful for me, I don't want to go travel and find that Snickers bar. I just want to be able to go and grab the first thing that's right outside my door. I'm just going to go grab whatever's available to me, and I'm going to go back where it's cool. So in this case, we would expect a line that looks like this. So as temperature increases, selection for those high quality resources, again, those resources that are high in nitrogen and low in fiber, that line would look something a little bit more like that. All right, what did we find? Oh, I forgot this part. This is an important part. Okay, so to be able to assess the vegetation that's out there, we spent a lot of time looking at plants and identifying plants. So the first thing we had to do was to figure out what's available to these guys. Where are the Snickers bars and how many of them are out there? So that's what we're doing here in this image. Then the second piece is to say, like, okay, what did they pick, right? So there's all this vegetation that's available to them. What did they end up selecting? And that's what we're doing here. So we're actually looking through a hay pile here, quantifying the vegetation that they've picked out, looking for those Snickers bars in there, and then going through and specifically identifying these plants. We then sent these plants off to a laboratory in Fort Collins that helped do a lot of our nutritional work and allowed us to start to answer these questions. All right, so you remember a pika wants food that is high in nitrogen. So we found that as temperature increased, as the surface temperature increased, pikas were more and more likely to go for those Snickers bars. They were more likely to be picking out foods that made it sort of worth the risk that they were experiencing. So that showed some pretty strong support for that food quality hypothesis, or the idea that you're going to be real choosy if it's stressful for you out there. All right, so what about fiber? Remember, pikas generally don't like foods that are high in fiber. They're just not, unlike sort of what we hear in our nutritional training. It's a little bit different for these guys. They want food that's low in fiber. All right, and in here, again, we found some pretty good support for that food quality hypothesis. So as temperature increased, we saw a decreased selection for that fiber. So basically, as it got hotter out, they said, no, thank you. I do not want the crappy food that's out there. Again, I'm only going for the good stuff. All right, so for this part, what did we find? Well, basically, we found that, yeah, as it gets warmer out, they're going to be more selective. They're going to go for those food sources that make it worth it to them. So kind of hold that idea in your mind. We'll come back to it at the end of the talk. All right, I said we were going to think about two questions. What to eat, which we just looked at, and when to eat, right? So that's another thing you could vary. If you're dealing with really hot conditions where you don't want to be outside, you could just change when you go outside, right? So that's sort of the idea behind this question, when to eat. And this is based in a whole just amazing array of adaptations that animals have for living in diverse environments, right? I mean, we have animals in Death Valley where we know it gets incredibly hot, and we have animals that live in the Arctic where it gets incredibly, incredibly cold. So we know that within the animal kingdom, there's this huge capacity to deal with all sorts of environmental variation. So an example I really like to talk about is this Cape ground squirrel right here, this little guy. So you find him in Africa, And one of the cool things that he's able to do, he lives in a really dry, hot environment in Africa, and he's able to use his tail. So you see his little tail right here, kind of like a parasol or an umbrella. So he extends it basically up over top of his head. And by doing that, he can reduce his body temperature by at least 5 degrees, which allows him to continue to forage despite the fact that it's really hot out and it's really stressful for him to be out there. So just such a remarkable adaptation for how species are dealing with these kind of interesting environments. So our question was, are we seeing sort of the same progression or change in behavior in pikas? Now, of course, pikas don't really have a tail. In fact, that's kind of a good trivia question. They don't have a visible tail. Technically, they have a teensy tiny tail, but they don't have a visible tail. So they're obviously not extending that up over their head and trying to cool themselves off. But what can they potentially do? Well, one of the ideas is just don't go outside, right? Like just don't be active when it's really hot out. So this is kind of the first finding from this part of our work. It's not terribly surprising, but it's an important finding in the sense that as surface temperature increases here on, this is called the x-axis, the horizontal axis, as surface temperature increases, we saw a decrease in activity as measured basically by how many times they were going to get food during an hour. So it gets hotter out, they just aren't as active. And that's what's happening sort of on what we call the population level. So like as a group overall, pikas tend to be less active when it's hot out. And you could think about like of those that live in neighborhoods, like, you know, generally maybe people aren't going outside quite as much when it's hot out. But also much like people, we found that not every individual pika did the same thing. And this piece was really surprising to me, to be honest. I sort of figured out that, well, I had figured out that when it gets warm, basically everybody just, you know, slows down their activity. But what we found was, yeah, for some animals that's true, some individuals that's true, and on sort of the neighborhood level, that's certainly true. But each of these lines here represents a separate individual that we sampled. And what I want you to notice is the huge array of different strategies that we see here. So here on the x-axis, this horizontal axis, we again have temperature. So it's getting warmer as you go along this axis. And then here on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, we have our measure of activity. So you have some individuals, like this guy or girl, I'm not sure, this guy or girl that just cranks it out when the temperature is suitable, but then as it warms up, they very quickly shut off their activity. So that is very different, however, from, say, this bright green line, where it sort of starts out at like a mediocre level of activity and kind of drops off, but not nearly in the same way that this one does. Or compare those two strategies to like this pink line, where basically they just kind of keep up a real slow and steady pace, and they don't really change their activity that much. So there's just this amazing breadth of strategies that are going on. All right, so then I wanted to ask the question, well, okay, if you're doing different things, does that mean that like one strategy is better than another? Do you end up getting a benefit if you're the individual that like cranks it out when it's really favorable and then shuts it off later on when it gets too hot? Well, this will take a little bit of explaining here, but I'll walk you through it. So here on this axis, we have your degree of flexibility, which is basically like critters on this end of the scale were the ones that basically the slow and steady didn't change their behavior very much. And critters on this end of the scale were the ones that were super active when temperatures were favorable and then basically shut it off when temperatures became unfavorable. And then here again, we have the amount of nitrogen in the food that they were collecting. Remember, pikas like foods that are high in nitrogen. So the conclusion for this whole figure here is basically if you worked smarter, if you worked harder when temperatures were favorable and shut it off when it was unfavorable, you didn't really get a good benefit from that, from a food quality perspective. You got about the same amount of nitrogen as an individual that just kind of kept trucking along all day long and didn't change their behavior. But what you did get was less stress. So again, here on the this horizontal axis, we have low flexibility here, high flexibility up here, and these are the number of occasions in which an individual was exposed to these really stressful temperatures. So as you hopefully can see, if you work smarter, if you were really flexible, you basically were exposed to less stress. So in total, you were able to get equivalent quality of food, but you encountered less physical stress, less physiological stress if you really were flexible, kept working really hard when temperatures were favorable, and then stopped working quite so hard when temperatures became too hot. All right, so the conclusion for this piece is that we did find sort of the strong negative effect of temperature on food collecting activity, and the individuals really varied in their response, and that by itself was pretty surprising, and that sort of variation in their response did provide them with a benefit that could be linked to their ability to survive in some of these potentially unfavorable environments. All right, I don't want you to walk out of here thinking that, well, pikas can just adjust, maybe other high elevation alpine species can just adjust as temperatures change, so we're gonna be fine. That is a part of the story here, but a lot of these strategies and the strategies that we see all across the world as species deal with environmental variability rely on having sufficient resources to be able to use these strategies. So for example, being really active and collecting high quality food when temperatures are favorable for you, that only works if there's good high quality food on the landscape. So as managers and as resource agencies, we need to be thinking about how do we continue to maintain the ability for these species to be flexible? How do we maintain access to this high quality vegetation? And how do we make sure that these temperature sensitive species have a place to go where they can dump all of that heat and where they can stay cool? A few final thoughts. As I showed you in that initial figure, temperatures are warming in Wyoming, whether it's helpful or fun for us to think about or not. And it affects nearly all species in certainly our ecosystems and really ecosystems of the American West. It's a new problem that requires some new thinking and some strategies that I think bring some really unique collaborations to the table. And one of those unique collaborations is working with citizens, working with people that care about these ecosystems to help us document the distribution of species. So those sorts of unique collaborations, I think, can provide us with a good path forward. And that path may provide us with a way to moderate exposure and promote resilience among some of our most threatened species. So with that, I'd like to thank my partners and funders. A really amazing suite of people and agencies and organizations came together to support this work, including folks at the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. So highly collaborative effort that would not have been possible without their support. And with that, I will end and see if there are any questions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, excellent question. So the question, did I get that? The question for those folks joining us online is sort of how does this, and I'll try to rephrase here, so catch me if I don't get it right. How does this sort of vulnerability change if you're, for megafauna that may be less available to genetic change and evolution and may have to rely more specifically on behaviors? Did I capture that correctly? Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things on that front. I mean, you are spot on in that these longer-lived species don't really have the opportunity to turn over their genes quite as quickly, right? So if you think about a mosquito has a really fast, what we call life history, doesn't live very long. We kill them quickly in many cases, so their genes are sort of like turning over really quickly. In longer lived species, think of like an elephant or a grizzly bear or some of our ungulates, we're not turning those genes over as quickly just because they live longer. So you're right, we expect to see some of these behavioral adaptations manifest more quickly in these sort of larger megafauna, longer lived species. There's a little bit of a debate in the literature, and I'll be nerdy for a very short amount of time, I promise. There is a debate in the literature of sort of, and your question touches on this, which is why it's very insightful. It touches on this concept of like, well, if I'm just changing my behavior, I'm sort of like protecting my genetics from having to do any of the hard work of making my like physiology more comfortable in these hotter environments. So maybe being able to alter my behavior is ultimately not a good thing because I'm sort of not forcing my genes to adapt to this new environment. I don't really know where the answer comes down on that. It's probably some sort of a hybrid, that in some species it's better to just adapt genetically, and in some species it's better to use behavior, and it may be time to sort of like how you fall out on this like mosquito versus, elephant, grizzly bear continuum. So great question, really good question.
I have one here from the online audience. Studies seem to focus on ambient temperature, but how does the amount of sun and wind impact activity?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So any of us that spend time outside know that like if you're in direct sunlight, that is a very different experience than if you're in a hot environment but in the shade. So yeah, our focus was on ambient temperature, and it was intended to basically measure the temperature that individuals were experiencing at that time. Of course, we were only measuring it in a couple of spots in their territories, so we might not have captured exactly what they were feeling and experiencing, but we got it as close as we could. The questioner has a really good point, though, that everything, wind influences how you experience temperature, sun position influences it, humidity, relative humidity has a big effect. If you go back east, or if you're from back east and you spend time in a humid environment, 80 degrees feels very different than it does here where it's a little bit drier of an ecosystem. Yeah, good question.
So,
yeah. Oh, good question. Yeah, so the question is, as we see these warming trends, is there any evidence of sort of pikas expanding northward or latitudinally? I'm going to give you a less than satisfying answer, which is we don't have documentation of that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. So I think in order to really defensively test that idea, we would need to have kind of like a consistent monitoring program kind of moving northward. There are a lot of very engaged, very committed pika researchers that are kind of spread out across the species range, but I don't know that we're doing a good job of kind of documenting any kind of like a movement north or expansion northward. Yeah, we haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. That's terribly unsatisfying, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, any changes in reproductive rates? Not that we know of. Pika reproduction is surprisingly difficult to monitor. So they they reproduce for here, I'll say here in sort of this ecosystem, they reproduce in like April, May, when there's still spring snowpack. And they're reproducing, well, I should have said this earlier. So basically pikas, when they're active, in the winter, in the spring, they're active in what's called the subnivean. So it's essentially there's like a layer of snow and then there's the ground, and pikas are active in this subnivean environment. So it's basically tunnels within the snow. This is where they have their offspring and they reproduce. So we have a lot to learn about sort of the number of offspring that are reproduced and how well they survive. So pikas on average produce like 2.3 or 2.5 offspring per litter. So they're pretty small litter sizes. And the interesting thing is that so they'll raise these kiddos up, the snow melts off, they allow them to become surface active. There's sort of some interesting hypotheses about how these little guys learn to behave. And then about a month into summer, mom is like, see ya later. I got my own hay pile to build. You got to go figure it out. And so she will kick them off. These basically, what are they at that point? Like 8-week-old little pika kiddos. They get kicked off. And sometimes they inherit a territory right adjacent to her. And sometimes they go far afield. So all of that is to say we haven't documented any changes in reproduction as it relates to temperature, but it's a really tough part of their life cycle to be able to observe. So stay tuned on that front. Yeah. Yeah, question is, what is their normal lifespan? It's in the probably 3 to 6 year range. There's been some really cool work in Montana. So, obviously just north of here, and then also some work in Colorado that has looked at sort of long-term demographic monitoring for these guys. And that seems to be about the range that it falls in. A little bit variable, kind of depends on where you are, but somewhere in that range. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is sort of about this, maybe smaller fauna are able to take advantage of cooler microclimates. Bigger fauna may be able to do the same thing, but they've got a little bit bigger capacity to search out more favorable environments. How does all of this kind of relate to birds, which obviously are they're volant, they fly, they can go different places, and some work has shown that they are pretty responsive to changing temperatures. So we've done some work on sagebrush birds, so the birds that you see flying around out here in the sagebrush flats. We've found, for those guys, really high fidelity to their breeding sites. They don't seem to be changing them as temperatures are getting warmer. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I'll diverge briefly, and then I'll go back to sort of your holistic question. So one of the interesting things that we've seen is, at least for sagebrush birds, they aren't really able to shift the timing of their movement in some of the ways that we've been able to see. Like, there's some really cool studies on some birds in Britain that have a pretty cool ability to adjust the timing of their migration. Our sagebrush birds don't seem to be doing the same thing. And in fact, what we're seeing is sort of they maximize reproduction at a pretty specific temperature window. All of that suggests that maybe they don't have kind of that sort of internal flexibility to respond to temperature, but that's one group of birds. And there are certainly examples of birds that are long-distance migrants that can really change the timing of their migration to match these temperature changes.
So question here, you've shown slides here of pikas being active during the day with remote cameras. This is two parts. Are they also active at night? And if so, or if not, could their behavioral plasticity cause them to be nocturnal, to take advantage of lower temperatures for foraging?
Excellent question, and one that I can give you a partial answer to. Let me advance slides for just a second. Okay, so this is some work that we did looking at that exact question, really with the idea of like, why don't you just go outside at night? Like, it's almost always cooler at night than it is during the day. So here on the x-axis, we have basically the hour. So this is, 2 a.m. progressing all the way through on the 24-hour clock. So 2 a.m. all the way through to midnight. This is nighttime, daytime, nighttime. And this is basically how active individuals were. We really didn't see that shift to nocturnal activity that I was hoping to see or thought might be a strategy. So here you can see essentially their activity rates as it relates to time of day. they're just much more active during the day than they are at night. Though interestingly, they are active at night, which was kind of cool to know. It's not like they totally, go to sleep at night. They do have some activity at night. I'm really interested in why they're not active at night, and I can't give you a good answer. A couple things that we've hypothesized is just their ability to sense prey and to sense danger. I even kind of have an interest in like dissecting their eyeballs and looking at like rods and cones, which might allow us to get a sense of, their perception of the landscape at night and what they can see. But my working hypothesis is they just can't perceive their landscape very well at night. They're in and out of these rocks, which are pretty complicated to navigate. And then, as one of my good friends calls pikas, they're kind of the hamburger of the wilderness, meaning everybody and everything eats them. So when everybody and everything eats you, you need to be really aware of your environment. So maybe that's the challenge that's going on there as well.
So kind of spinning off of that a bit, if they have a wide range of predators, has that cued in the hay piles as, hey, this is a location where you have pikas? And are we seeing any kind of relationship between the size of a pile or the discreteness of a cache and predation?
Yeah, so we documented some pretty interesting behaviors on these cameras, right? So we had 4,000 videos, and in 4,000 videos, you see a lot of interesting stuff. I don't know if predators are per se queuing in on these hay piles, but you certainly see weasels in particular that are very active around the hay piles. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like you think about a weasel, it's a very long, it's like a hot dog, wiener dog looking shape. So it's very long and skinny, which means it cuts off one of Pika's main defenses, which is to escape into these rocky crevices where most animals can't go, but a little hot dog-shaped weasel can go. So weasels are pretty lethal predators for these guys, and I have seen them hang out around hay piles. Whether that's like a strategy that they're using, for sure, I don't really know, but they certainly are present around the hay piles. Yeah. Yeah, the question is, what's the minimum altitude for pikas here in this ecosystem, and have we documented any sort of a change? Let me tell you a little story about that. So if you would pick up a guidebook until relatively recently, it would tell you that pikas in North America, or at least in Wyoming, Montana, Colorado area, Intermountain West, that you would find them starting at about 8,000 feet. So when I embarked on this work, that was where I started looking, was like, we're going to start at 8,000 feet. That's what the guidebook says. That's where we're going. And at the time, I had a really fun collaboration with an engaged group of citizens who were helping just to document the distribution of pikas in some of these study areas. And one of them came back with a verified observation of a pika at about 5,500 feet, which is substantially lower than what the guidebook was saying. And I kind of thought, oh, are you sure? Like, are you really sure? And absolutely, they had pictures of it. They had some really cool observations. And those of you that know the area well, this is over by Jackson in the Snake River Canyon. It's actually just off of a hiking trail. You can see pika hay piles around there. And once we started looking at that lower elevation, indeed, we found a lot at that. So I don't know exactly what I would say at this point, but it's certainly 5,000 feet, maybe lower than that in some places. In Oregon, they're actually very close to sea level. This is kind of a cool thing. They are very close to sea level in the Columbia River Gorge. And the reason that we think they can persist there is because it's sort of a natural cooling environment, like cool air pools in that gorge. And then there's some really interesting mosses that help to kind of buffer temperature there as well. So it allows for some cooling, some of that microsite stuff that you were asking about earlier. All right, yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question is, does the activity of a pika change based on lunar phase? And I think what you're getting at there is, like, if the moon is bright, then maybe they have better visual acuity, maybe they can move around their environment a little better. We tested that and did not see what I would call a convincing relationship. There may be something there. So we saw a little bit of an uptick during like full moons, or sort of full moon and kind of bracket it on either side, not quite full moons. But it wasn't enough to meet sort of our bar of like a statistically defensible relationship. So I think there could be something going on there. We just weren't able to really show it. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, why is the temperature so critical to pikas? Sort of what's that like factor that really influences what's going on? And it's the last part of what you said. It's a physiological response. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there were some experiments that were run, I'm going to say in the 50s, but don't hold me to that, where they basically put a couple of pikas out in full sun and looked to see what their response would be if they didn't have the ability to sort of go to a cool environment. And they died at about 77 degrees. So it's an innate physiological response. Pikas are most closely related to rabbits. So a lot of people think it's rodents and mice. It's not, it's rabbits. And so they have some of that same physiology, some of that same sort of like high stress that just comes along with being part of the rabbit family. All right. Oh, yes. Yeah, so the question is, are the hay piles like a community resource, or are they tied to individuals? So they are 98% of the time, I feel very comfortable with that number, 98% of the time, they are tied to an individual. So the pikas are known for something that's called kleptoparasitism, which is just a real fancy way to say stealing. So basically there has been evidence of an adjacent pika coming in and sort of yoinking a resource from a neighbor's food cache. Because we had all these videos, we actually took the time to look at that and quantify it. It's a very rare event, even though it's kind of like fun in an ecology, natural history context to talk about. It really doesn't happen very often. So it's essentially one pile, one pika. And they are very defensive of their little territories. So a fun fact for you. Pikas, when they fight in two ways. So, well, probably more than that, but I've observed two ways. One of which is they chase an offender off and they try really hard to bite its butt while it's running away. So you'll see these pikas that have little chunks out of their pelage on their rear ends. And the other way that they do it is they box. And you can actually find pictures of this online. So they'll stand up on they kind of sit back on their hind legs, and they actually sort of use their front paws to pelt each other in the face. It's a very interesting behavior to observe. So they are highly territorial. And don't be fooled by their cuteness. They are surprisingly aggressive. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, with the hay piles, what kind of happens to them over a year's time? They do degrade. So they will sort of degrade over time as winter progresses. And one of the really fascinating pieces, I cannot take credit for this, but some other researchers found that pikas, and as far as I know, they're one of the only mammals in the world that do this. They cache food that is too toxic for them to eat at the time that they cache it. So when they pick it out of the ground, it would be almost lethal to them to consume at that time. They take it over, they put it in their hay pile, and as that hay pile degrades over time, the toxins in the plants also degrade and allow them to be able to eat that food. So it sort of serves as like a preservative for that food item, which is pretty phenomenal when you think of an animal that can, fit in the palm of your hand, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, where do we go from here? What are these next questions that we want to study? And for me, I am very interested in, if you think back to those sort of slow and steady, kind of what I think of the tortoises and the behavior that we showed. So those individuals that aren't changing their behavior, why aren't they changing it? Why aren't they doing what everybody else is doing and sort of having that really steep change in behavior? And I'm wondering, is it body size? Are they, so smaller organisms can tend to shed heat into the environment a little bit easier than bigger organisms. So is it that they're smaller? Is it that they have a different color of pelage that is more reflective of the sun? Is it that there's some kind of a trade-off going on where if you're, maybe there's a connection between being really flexible in your behavior, but maybe you're missing out on something else if you are? So I'm really curious to explore those other individuals and to determine if this is a viable strategy sort of long-term, if we can continue to have these slow and steady guys, or if they're going to sort of wink out as temperatures warm. Okay, thank you guys so much. This has been such a delight. Thank you.